my point is, we're going to keep it in-house is a phrase that clues us into how things get inversely labeled. Because it is true that you can successfully compete by being more insightful than others. But being more insightful than others is difficult, and everybody's trying to do it. Another way to be more insightful than others is to
compete successfully.
To compete successfully is to delay an understanding that others might reach. And if they had it too, then we would all be on a level playing field. But if I know the mice are broken and you don't know the mice are broken, then I'm ahead in the science game.
So the two ways to outcompete other people are to actually be better or to engage in sabotage. Those are your two categories.
Right.
And sabotage might be too narrow a term, but broadly speaking, actually be better, actually outcompete at the, like, we're trying to do X, I did X better than you. Or I'm going to get in your way of accomplishing X, of seeing X, of knowing what X is hinging on, all of that stuff over in subterfuge and sabotage space.
And ecologically speaking, we have terms for this, right? We have the term exploitation competition, which means I'm going to get to that flower before you do, right? I'm going to get to the nectar, and that means you're going to have less nectar available to you. But I'm not interfering with your ability to get the nectar. I'm just more effectively reaching it.
Yeah, I got it, and it's zero sum, and the nectar's in me now, so There's none left for you.
There's none left for you. So that's the kind of competition that we all expect when we hear, I'm going to make a better product, and it's going to mean that the niche in the market isn't available to you because everybody's going to want the version that I built, right?
Beautiful world.
Right. But then there's this other kind of competition called interference competition. And interference competition is where, instead of elaborating my capacity to get to a rare resource, I'm going to interrupt your ability to get there. I'm going to do damage to you so that you can't get there. And
yeah, at weekend bar scenes, this is known as cock blocking.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a perfect example of interference competition, actually, right? Like,
yes, this is it is that. So the argument I'm trying to flesh out here is that we all understand the scientific endeavor based on the sort of brochure understanding of what's supposed to happen. What's supposed to happen is we are all trying to be more insightful than everybody else, and those who have special, insight into the world come to inhabit the powerful positions. They are more influential on students. Science gets better over time as a result of their efforts. That's how it's supposed to work.
Again, beautiful world. A
beautiful world. But we neglect the interference competition. And this is, one of the flaws with what we call peer review, which, as we often say here, is not the same thing as review by peers, which is a good thing. If you have peers, it's good for them to review your work. But peer review, the privately done thing that prevents your work from ever seeing the light of day, that is another story entirely. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is we live in a democracy, right? The West is built of democracies. And inside of those democracies, we have markets. We have capitalism. These are two distinct modes of thinking, really. On the one hand, in a democracy, we are supposed to all be on the same page that we want our nations to do well, right? So if you think back to the paper that we first showed, right, the tension between how well your lineage or population does is one way of getting ahead. If your nation is strong, that's good for you. And then the other way of getting ahead is competition within your lineage, right? And so because we live in these structures that gather us together, we are supposed to have effectively a patriotic instinct where we want science to be more insightful, right? And we also want to rise within science. But the problem is that these two things are at cross purposes with each other. And unfortunately, whatever it is that in the 21st century is making us ununderstandable to each other, is polarizing us, is dividing us into teams that are in which the people on the other team begin to seem inhuman to you. The problem is that pushes us into a mode where we don't see our shared interest. What we see is our opportunity to get ahead. And in such a world, we have to ask the question, in whose interest is it to have an honest-to-goodness newspaper, right? One that does the journalistic work of figuring out what's true, irrespective of how that makes the people in power feel, right? In whose interest is that if we are divided into teams and trying to get ahead, I'm trying to get ahead at your expense, right? You and I are supposed to be aligned, but if I'm trying to get ahead at your expense, then it is not in my interest that there be a public-spirited journalistic establishment that sorts through the truth.
It's also true that, just as you said, that when people think about competition, the thing that is in their head is exploitation competition, almost always. I got the thing, I've therefore demonstrated that I was able to get it, and I am therefore a better competitor, as opposed to all the forms of interference competition, which also include, legacy reasons for having gotten there and, all of this. I'm sorry, I just lost the connection to what you were exactly saying.
You'll get it back in just a second.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So what I was getting at is there are many institutions that are failing simultaneously. We can all see it. All right. Why are they failing simultaneously? Because the thing that they are supposed to do is counterproductive for those who are playing on teams within our lineages, within our nations, right? Do those who are trying to get ahead at the expense of others within their nation, within the West, within the world, do those who are attempting to do that want universities to be engaged in trying to figure out what actually works? I mean, what would happen if a university actually figured out that some generic drug that nobody owns was the most effective tool we had at our disposal against COVID? That would get in the way of, a huge number of billions of dollars of potential profits. So you don't necessarily want truth-seeking to be a powerful, independent force. You want it to be something else. How much do you want the children of your children's competitors? How much do you want your children's competitors to be well educated, right? We've been battling for our entire lives over the nature of public education, how much to invest in it, what the content should be. Part of that may be that we honestly disagree about what the content is, but part of that are people who can't say what they're really up to, which is sabotaging the intellectual capacity of their children's competitors. So this is really the argument, is that we have a system in which something doesn't want the truth labeled as truth because it wants it privatized. It's keeping it in-house. When you are playing against others inside of an entity like a nation or a culture or an institution, your interest is not in having the information available to everybody. Your incentive is to privatize as much of that information as possible. And if you can do it, causing people to have an allergic reaction to the truth is great because it will blind them to being able to find the insight that you alone want to profit from.
Yeah, there it is. That's where I thought we were going, which is the allergic, not just the fact that there seems to be a non-independent across the board set of conclusions that are in many cases the opposite of what is true. And that in itself should trigger people to think that's not likely. What single or a couple of data points, rather sources of stories, of scientific stories, really, did those things come from? But also, okay, so you've got a whole lot of people believing the opposite of what is true, but it's worse than that. It's a kind of cognitive autoimmunity where you've got people actually allergic to the truth, not just believing something that is wrong, but when the true thing is pointed out, this has been done well enough that the actual truth feels dangerous, feels scandalous, feels like those people who say such things must be barbarians of some sort. And of course, we should all always try to keep the barbarians at the gate. So there's this tension of like explicitly tribalistic thinking at many, many different levels, where at each point that someone will begin to say, wait, I'm not sure about that. What will happen to them is they'll be triggered to be reminded, like, oh, no, if you got to think like us, or else we may not be able to protect you anymore. Or you definitely don't want to be on the outside of science. And, for those of us who are saying, actually, a bunch of scientists, us included, are saying that's not science. And anyone who tells you to follow the science has just revealed that they don't know what science is. Well, for the vast majority of people, including especially, I think, those who see themselves as educated because they have degrees that make the claim that they're educated, most people didn't ever do any science. And to the extent that they did, it was probably taught badly, because teaching science, especially to people who aren't majoring in science, is not a priority at our universities at all. It's not. It's very, very rarely done well, and it's even more true. Well, in some ways, it's more true. Sort of the younger the kids you're talking about teaching. So you have a vast educated class who knows, as I've said this many times before, knows that they are innumerate, knows that they can't do math, and they're almost proud of that. But the idea that also they don't really know what science is, and at the point that people show up saying that thing that we arrived at, that we are told that was arrived at by extraordinarily rapid behind closed doors consensus, and that's the science, and now you have to just go with the science, doesn't sound like science. Too many people with this cognitive autoimmunity, which is exactly what you have just walked us through, will say, oh, no, now you've gone too far. I know that now what you're doing is putting me in danger and putting me at risk of basically stepping outside of the bounds of, respectable conversation, cocktail party talk, the people who claim to be scientists because I can tell because they got glassware, whatever the indicators are right now. And really at some level, we're also back to fashion, right? This is it is in part like, well, I'm going to look around and see what other people are doing. Oh, everyone's following the science. I guess I'll follow the science. And when some scientists stand up and say, no, say, well, but you're not, where are your flasks? Where's your lab coat? And so people look for the indicators as opposed to, I'm going to have to actually do the work and think about the technical details. Or was there a hypothesis? Or how was that funded? Where were the incentives? What's the background? What was that based on? Do mice actually have long telomeres or not? Right?
So it's the trappings of science and something, and I will just say I'm agnostic about how much consciousness was involved in this system, right? There's clearly a degree of self-assembly of this system, but
that's the wonder of selection, right? I mean, that's exactly true.
Right.
There needs to have been no conspiracy. That doesn't suggest that there was no conspiracy, but it doesn't require it.
There will have, there are little conspiracies all the time, right? Inside of corporations, inside of departments, inside of newsrooms, right? People decide what they're going to report, what they're not going to report. There's supposed to be a sort of North Star of what you're doing. And the problem is, if you follow the North Star of science, what happens to you? Well, you probably don't make it through graduate school, right? It's very dangerous for you if you exhibit too much independence and a willingness to point out what's wrong with the thinking of people who are too powerful. So, what happens if you set up a selective system like that is the people who end up with the lab coats and the chairs of departments and, the endowed chairs and the awards and all of those things. The people who are in those positions are specifically the ones who are good at the social game of science, but not inherently good at thinking scientifically or behaving like a scientist when it's awkward for power. And that's
the skill sets may, in fact, not be unlikely to be found coincident with one another.
Yeah, they're
management of the modern scientific bureaucracy and thinking carefully, scientifically, logically, thoroughly, such that you will often find that actually something that you've based a bunch of experiments on, you're going to have to undo. You're going to have to stop that and do this over here. there's going to be a lot of reasons that you don't necessarily find those two things in the same person.
Right. And it wasn't always that way. I'm sure there was always a degree of that, right? There have always been people who've been good at the social system, and we're less good at science. But the problem is something has flipped the incentives so that to be good at science means that you're very unlikely to succeed in what we call by that name. And that results in a predicament that I have some sympathy for the public here. The public cannot fathom how it could be that all of the people, right, that the entire medical profession could get something wrong. I mean, that's one thing if nobody knows, but if the answer is available and the entire medical profession gets it wrong, that suggests something dire has occurred, which it has. What is the dire thing? Something has started, let's put it this way. Things like science and democracy are extremely dangerous to power, right? If you have power, you can lose power, right? Having a democracy that can elect people whose allegiances you don't know in advance, that's very dangerous to power. Having science that can discover that something that you're doing is actually very dangerous, or that there's a much better way to do what it is that you're profiting from that would be much less destructive, right? Having science empowered to do that is very dangerous to power. And so the idea is, one thing you might find amongst those who have accumulated great power is a reluctance about these very systems that threaten them, right? Journalism, science, public-spirited regulation, democracy, all of these things are, the whole reason that they're good is that they are indifferent to power. And so it's not surprising that power would begin to take aim at them, and it would say, well, of course we love science. I mean, look at all the technology that is born from science, but why do we want to share it with everybody? Right? That's the question, right? So actually, now that I think about it, we do not expect our military to be interested in sharing its finest weapons technology openly, right? We expect our military to want to keep an advantage that comes from being ahead in terms of the technology of the weaponry. And what I'm really arguing is that that very same thing has happened inside of places where it's explicitly not supposed to, right?
Well, and obviously facilitated, like how could you possibly reverse that trend at the point that the euphemistic public-private partnerships become the law of the land? At the point that our publicly funded research, including both basic research, which is to say research that does not have a clear applied reason to exist, but also including the research that maybe is trying to do drug discovery, right? That at the point that all of our publicly funded research, much of it is now in like active, explicit cahoots with trying to find private partnerships because that's where the money comes from. You have spoiled something that you had no right to spoil. And however many stories you tell yourself about how great that is, that now we've got more money coming in for research that needs to be done, the fact is that public funding of research has an ability, at least in theory, to steer clear of the profit motive that private corporations cannot, because that's why they exist.
Yeah, actually, I think you've nailed it. That the public-private partnerships are fundamentally flawed, because although it is true that a private entity benefits from science advancing the ball, it succeeds better when the outgrowth is not publicly shared.
That's right.
And that's a fundamental conflict in terms of the objective. Public spiritedness is effectively dying in front of us, and the institutions are doing exactly what you would expect them to do if you just simply removed the public spiritedness and therefore allowed rent seeking to dominate them.
Yep.
And the trouble is that it also plays into this issue of the big lie. that although everybody kind of gets that something isn't right with the institutions, it's almost impossible to believe that that the things that they say are misinformation are actually information.
Yep.
Right? What are the chances of that? Well, the answer is the chances are good because of evolution and market forces and game theory. But if you're not expert in those things, you may think, well, all right, I'm sure there's a lot of nonsense in those institutions, but they couldn't possibly be that wrong.